Welcome to Biblical Buffet. This episode is actually an addition to what I have left out in our last class. I promised that I will say a couple words about Revelation 13:18 and number 666. Everything started. If you'll go to the previous video on Introduction to Revelation, everything started as a kind of funny spin-off on the topic that my last check for my air conditioning job was $666, And so we started to talk about this, and I promised that I will explain why it is not a scary number. So even though we can make it scary, even darker, something, I don't know, some kind of horns put here and there, and gloomy pictures here, something. Regardless of that, the point is, so we are going to read backwards. What I mean is, we'll start with Revelation, we'll go to the middle of the Bible to explain why it is that what's going on, and then we'll come basically almost to the very beginning to the book of Deuteronomy. So before we will be scared with that number, and you know that there are many associations with Monsters Drink, with websites, and so on and so forth. And I can explain how that came up. Before we'll dive ourselves into the fears, what we need to understand that in the book of Revelation, in chapter 13, we have two beasts, two living creatures who rule. One of them is beast that comes of the sea, and sea in the Bible is associated with Gentiles. So that's a ruler that comes from Gentiles. There is another one, that beast that comes from the land. And in Revelation and in the Bible, it's mostly the ruler for people of Israel, that in the land of Israel. So his mark, verse 18. This call is for wisdom, That's a very important word. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666, So, we have two ways, as I explained, we have few ways to interpret Revelation. One of them is to remember all the horror movies or some kind of scary movies or some kind of movies with aliens and so on and so forth. When we close our eyes, remember all of that and try to explain the Bible. And then the barcodes, all the codes in your life, the number of your passport or number of your IP address, that's where it comes into play. Or your license plate. One good friend of mine, very godly man in one of our church, has a license plate with 666. Or if you get a paycheck with $666, that's a terrible thing, really scary. It almost brings you a heart attack unless you know what Bible says. So the second thing is to see what Bible really says about that. So what the Bible says is, to understand Revelation, first of all, we need to go to 1 Kings. In chapter 10, verse 14, that's where it appears. And that's why I kind of brought your attention that the word wisdom is important. If you think about wisdom and the Bible, apart from Jesus, who you think of? Solomon. Right. So, in chapter 10, in 1 Kings, we are talking about Solomon. Now, the weight of gold that came to Solomon in 1 year was 666 talents of gold. I know for us it doesn't make any sense because we are in different money measuring system. But just think, the country size of, state of Maine or New Hampshire, really small, would produce taxes. It's not what their annual money growth. I'm not really into finances. That's my bad. I should have studied more. But what I'm pointing at is they would give Solomon money in their taxes like few trains of gold. Okay? It's huge number. He collected too much. He absorbed too much money. And that's the beginning of his failure. Because his failure has 3 steps. One of them is collecting too much money. Then he starts to collect chariots and horses with horsemen, and this is chapter 10 verse 26 and further. And in chapter 11 verse 1, now King Solomon loved many foreign women along with the daughter of Pharaoh. So he had one wife, daughter of Pharaoh, and that was his normal lawful wife. And then he ended up with 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he had 999 women overboard that he shouldn't have, more than normal wife. How do we know it's a failure? We know it's a failure from Deuteronomy 17, 14 to 17. When we read what Moses told people of Israel right before they entered the land, he said, when you will enter the land, okay, you might want to choose yourself a king. So the concept of king is not anti-God. It's not godless concept. The problem with choosing the king the way they did is they were looking for a king like other nations. Okay? Not the king that would be after heart of God. So when you will come to the land that the Lord God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and they will say, I will set the king. You may indeed set the king. Now, verses 16 and 17. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself, or cause people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses. Verse 17. And he shall not acquire many wives. And the last part. And he shall not acquire for himself extensive silver and gold. So what we have is a failure of Solomon, which is, we see that this is a failure because we have a standard for the king in Deuteronomy. So when we read Revelation, what we actually see is a leader of Israel who at least begins to fail, or somewhat in the failing process against God's will. Stay safe and blessed.